right, Danny. Today, I want to talk about grace and justice.
Oh,
And this is something that I started thinking about this directly because of a sermon that I heard you preach, but indirectly because I don't know if you've noticed, but there's kind of a lot of like injustice happening
it's
around in the world
certainly
today.
it's certainly at a high clip at the moment.
Yeah.
It's very high. And for depending on when people listen to this, I feel like it's as we're recording, it's very high at this exact moment.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, it's like, it's always, and I was thinking about this as I was thinking about the topic. I was like, it's just always been like this. There's always something. Someone is always doing a bad thing and getting away with it, it seems. But um, we as Christians also believe in grace. And so I wanted to chat about these two things. So are you down?
Yeah, I'm so down. These are two of my favorite topics. I was thinking about this a little bit even as I was driving home yesterday after preaching that I can't remember what country music star, but they posted something that I feel like I should get credit for. They said they're too conservative for liberals and too liberal for conservatives. And I'm like, I've been saying that before whatever country music star said this. But it made me think like my sermon, there's a specific pastor that I'm sure doesn't listen to this podcast, but we are colleagues and friends. And I know that I drive him bananas because I talk too much about grace. And he loves the idea of your seat at the table can't cost someone else theirs, except for it meaning that like an abuser or someone eventually gets redemption, and that justice doesn't mean like excommunication. You know what I mean? So I do think
Yeah.
about that a lot, like the idea that like grace and justice is something that generally quote progressive people push for, but I'm watching the pendulum swing where that grace is being offered less and
Mm.
it's bending more towards justice, which I'm like all for justice. But yeah, where are you at? Like what do you got? What do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I have definitely been called like a bleeding heart more than once. So I'm big on mercy, I think,
Uh-huh.
and grace sometimes is difficult for me, to be honest with you, just because of kind of what you were saying, your other pastor friend, like, and that you feel like you're seeing the pendulum swing in the other direction. I think from my perspective, it seems like a lot of people in power have gotten away with doing wrong pretty much scot-free for so long that I'm just really angry. And I'm like, when is like we can't just do grace forever. When is the justice gonna come in? Like that's my feeling, you know. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah. I
And
think
also
it's
sometimes grace feels more like it doesn't feel like grace. It feels like ignoring or protecting or sweeping under the rug. Like it's not actually like I feel like grace is this really beautiful thing that we can offer each other. And it's getting kind of like bastardized into just ignoring harm that's done.
yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's somewhat turned into like, and I think bastarditis is a good phrase because it turned into this like version of turn the other cheek, and I forgot the other ism or the other phrase it was, but it's like this idea that it's just getting walked all over, right?
Mm-hmm.
And or forgive and forget. That was the other one. And like I don't even know that grace is forgiving and forgetting. Like
Mm-hmm.
we oftentimes think that's what it means. So you said something a second ago. I would just love to know you differentiate between grace and mercy because you said that
Mm-hmm.
kind of quick. Like, what do you, when you look at the difference or the over, if there's a Venn diagram of those, like, do you see those overlapping? Are they different? And like, if you have a tangible example, how would you show grace versus mercy in a situation?
Yeah. Okay. Um, I automatically think about the feature-length VeggieTales film that came out when I was a kid, but it's like the Jonah movie, the
Uh-huh.
Jonah VeggieTales movie. And they talk about grace and mercy in that. And I
Okay.
think that's like I saw it when I was a kid, and so that like formed my definition of these
Yeah.
two things. Um, so basically, to like really boil it down, in my mind, grace is undeserved mercy for a wrongdoing. So
Okay.
if you're being shown grace, you did do something wrong. Like you you sinned, you committed a crime, you enacted harm upon somebody else, and you are being shown mercy even though you don't deserve it. And I used the term mercy in my definition of grace, but I feel like mercy is like clemency. Like it's like mercy is a punishment or a sorrow or a suffering being removed and taken from you, whether or not you did something. And I think that like the wrongdoing part, the fault piece is less important in acts of mercy than it is. So it's kind of like in my mind also sometimes like it's like a square is always a rectangle, but a rectangle is not always a square type of a deal. So like they're related, but they're not exactly the same. So yeah.
So I just think about this like in terms of like real time and real action and like what do we do with this? And so do you remember? I mean, I must have been in college. I think I've talked about this on the podcast at some point in some episode hundreds ago or whatever. But do you remember when that Amish community, there was like a shooting and a bunch of like people were killed in this Amish community, and they showed up with like a level of like grace for, I think the shooter ended up like taking their own life, but like there was like the family of the shooter and they're like, we're offering great. I can't remember what it was, but it was like, I remember watching the news story of it, and it was whether it was the family of the person or the shooter themselves, like this Amish community offered like a mind bending level of grace where it was like the community around. There were two kind of like answers. Like people were like, this is so good. Like this is like amazing levels of grace. And then I think there was this other pushback of like, I could never do that. And do you know that story? Like, have you seen or heard that story? I like butchered it.
I feel like I kind of faintly remember maybe hearing about that. It probably depends on like when it occurred and how old I was, and maybe like when I would have. I don't know if it was that long ago.
I feel like it was like I might have been an undergrad, so it might have been a pretty.
Okay, so I was probably like in middle school because you're like almost 10 years older than me.
I think that's probably right. Yeah. Now I know this. So I guess what I was thinking of is like in theory, like, so I'm a pacifist in theory. Everyone likes to remind me that like I'm probably not in practice, and I have not been put to the test to find that out. But I think grace is somewhat similar, right? Because it's our response to like pain happening to us or to others. And so like when you look around at like the things that Donald Trump is doing, the things that like we look at like the Epstein files, and we look at these things and like we see these things that are, and I don't even know that those are at all political statements. They're just like objectively harmful things happening out there that like grace can be extended for or might not be. Like, how do you in real time reconcile that? Because I think for like a lot of progressive Christians, that's the biggest rub, because it seems like we're giving permission to the abusers if we give grace. And then the other side is like, I might argue, like, we're not acting like Jesus if we don't give grace. And so it's like, what do we do? And how do you like in real time reconcile that?
Yeah. And I guess my simple answer is I don't know. And I think that this is part of the reason I wanted to talk about this is that I think in practical application, this is something that I wrestle with a lot. When I think about especially crimes committed against, I mean, you mentioned the Epstein files. When I think about that, and it's been in the news so often, I think about crimes committed against children. I am filled with not just like anger, but fury. Like I want punishment. I don't think grace would even be righteous in that scenario of like, you know, showing somebody mercy for something that is so abhorrent and so harmful. But then I guess I think to myself, like, well, where do I draw the line? Because the faith tradition that I come from, the way that sin, it was, you know, Calvinism, the total human depravity thing. All sin was taught to me as equal in God's eyes. Like I don't know if you've ever seen the bar chart analogy. So it's like, okay, so visual bit for the audio format, but picture like a bar chart.
Okay.
And so like murder is like really, really tall on the chart. And maybe like stealing candy from a convenience store is like really, really
Right.
small. But then if you look up, the like metaphor is like God is above everything. So like if you look at it from the top down, they're both like squares and they look like they're the same height and blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
So the way I was brought up, I was very much taught that all sins are the same. So it doesn't matter if it is like a murder in cold blood or lying to your friend about something. Those are equal in God's eyes. But during my deconstruction, something that I did kind of take apart was like the level of harm that that causes in real life is not the same. Like those sins are not
Yeah.
equal. And so I have a hard time thinking about, and I think maybe because I'm just like butting up against this theology that I don't believe in anymore, but is still so kind of like integral to my worldview because it was formative for me.
Yeah.
I guess I just like, I don't know where the line is.
Yeah. I mean, so one, I've never heard that before. That's
Yeah.
a really interesting like visual to like think about. And I was like I'm a pretty visual person. So I was visualizing this shift from the side view to the top view. And that was as far as preaching analogies go, illustrations go, that's actually like pretty good. I don't know how theologically good it is, because I'm with you on like I didn't even go where you went on how it's problematic in terms of like the ripple effects of destruction in the world, which is certainly how I look at sin. Like as just a quick aside, like I look at and I use The Good Places, the TV show, as a way to think about this in some ways, and I actually thought about this when I was in the shower this morning. One of my shampoo bottles said like we're fighting against animal cruelty. And I'm like, am I sinning just by using body wash that like animals have been
Yes.
like, so it's like
Yeah.
every decision is very complicated, right? Like nothing
Yeah.
is as simple, which is kind of what The Good Place is getting at as a show. It's like there's lots of ripple effects in that. And so
Yeah. It's
certainly
like the idea of
murder.
like, if you use a shampoo that's created by a company that tests on animals, are you complicit in animal cruelty? Is like the
Yes,
idea.
right.
Yeah.
Yes. So I thought about that, and like the idea that, like you said, I think murder certainly has more ripple effects in the community. Like it doesn't just impact the person that was killed, but it impacts the family of the killer. Like that family now has something that's happened. It happens, impacts the family of the murdered. It impacts the community. It impacts everyone that sees it on the news. And the kid that stole the candy from the big corporation from Schnucks, like that's not as big of a deal, right? In terms
Right.
of the ripple effects. Now, so I didn't think about any of that when you were talking. So I appreciated you saying that. What I thought about was that as I thought about the problematic nature, as good of an illustration as it is from a preaching perspective. That is a system of control, because that's trying to say that no matter what you do, you're messed up, right? And no
100%.
matter
Yeah.
what you do, you need our help or Jesus' help or whoever, but you need to be under our umbrella to make sure, because no matter what you do, because what it's not actually saying is that murder is as bad as stealing. What it's saying is stealing candy is as bad as murder, which
Yes.
is semantic, but it's like a different feeling to be like, to a murderer, to hear like, oh, you know what you did is not, it's just as bad as someone that stole candy. To that person, it's like, oh, that's grace. To the person that stole candy, it's like, it's weight and burden and punishment. Like I'm as bad as the serial killer, right? And I think that's where I butt up against it. Is this is, and we've talked about this a little bit on a few episodes already, but it's like all of this in some ways is rooted in control. And that is the pushback I have on any of this, because I'm like an unlimited grace person. Like I think that everyone deserves grace. And I ultimately believe everyone will embrace, or at least have the opportunity to embrace that. But what I don't have as much time for is like the moving around in the gymnastics that we do to like try to control people, to make them feel shame, but then to give permission to people. Like in you sent me some notes before it. You said something about like evangelicals' reaction to the Epstein files. There's mental gymnastics there, right? Like they want
Yeah.
people to be controlled by the idea that all sins are equal. But when it's their people's sins, they're like, well, it's probably not a sin. And like, that's where I get kind of frustrated, is like, we're not really playing by the same rules. And the rules are set by the people that want them to be convenient for them, if that makes sense, you know?
No, 100%. I And I think you kept using the phrase high control, and I think that nails it, because even though I don't think that my preachers and pastors and people that were giving me that like bar chart illustration were like, ooh, let's preach this to the congregation so they'll all fall under our control. Like, I don't think that's the active mindset behind it, but that is the result. Like, if you tell a group of people, and then what it also does is invents this whole like system of thought crimes, which I'm sure some other former high control religious members were a part of like that one verse in the Bible that it's like, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery with her in your mind or whatever.
Right.
And that being weaponized of like, oh, well, now even your thoughts. So even if you think about killing someone, in God's eyes, that's murder. You killed somebody in the eyes of God. And that is, first of all, an insane thing to say. That's absolutely wild.
It is wild.
And it also, like, yes, it creates this structure of shame, which, yes, I've talked about in the past, was really, really harmful to me. The ripple effect of that was, I thought I was horrible. And it also creates this structure in which victims never have a claim to victimhood. So
yeah,
in like talking about the Epstein files, I think that's it's just a cultural like touch point right now, which I feel like is why we keep going back to it. But this happens a lot, especially in my experience, especially to women in the church, where an injustice will occur. A woman is treated unfairly or abused by a member of the church, sometimes the staff, sometimes the congregation. And when it gets taken to church leadership, they're told, well, you're not innocent either. You did XYZ. Well, you're not perfect either. We need to extend grace. So like, there's always this leveling of what happened, when in some cases abuse has occurred, like actual intentional abuse and objectification. So it's not fair, because so far we've really just kind of covered grace, but I also want to talk about justice, because I believe that the God we see depicted in the Bible, both God the Father and Jesus, also show examples of justice too, which we don't need to get in. Well, I mean, maybe we can't talk about this without talking about the Old Testament, but like, because I think a lot of those stories were more, well, whatever. We don't need to get into it, but like, but what are some ways that Jesus also modeled justice for us?
Yeah. I mean, justice is interesting, right? Because I think about, from my perspective, like, where am I putting on God's view of justice and Jesus' application of justice, and where am I putting on my view of this? Because I think, like, in human terms, generally when we say justice, we mean getting hit back for the way you hit, right? Like, I just think we still have a pretty, like, my son is 11 years old and he plays hockey. He thinks justice is when his teammates get checked that he levels someone else, right? Like, that's justice, it's retribution. And I think that's kind of how we view justice. And I say to my son, he's like the lead goal scorer on their team. I was like, you can't help your team from the penalty box, especially when your goal is to be the scorer. And I think like that's a little bit of like how we look at justice. Like, I think sometimes we get hurt and then we hurt someone back and then we are sidelined because of what we did. Like, the person that hits back is always the one that gets in trouble. I think that's true in sports and often is true in real life. And I think Jesus doesn't respond like that, but Jesus does call out injustice. Like, Jesus does, he flips the tables when he goes into the temple, and that's injustice. He sees like religious people like perverting the temple and doing these things, and he doesn't walk in with like kind words. He doesn't even walk in without violence to some degree. Like, he walks in with like destruction of this holy sacred place, which, like, think about if Jesus showed up now and he went into like a hardcore church that was like a mega church and he was like, this is perverting my stuff, and he started flipping, he would get arrested and he would throw him, like, he would never get any sort of like traction in that. And Jesus was killed in his time, right? Like, so I think that like Jesus certainly pushed back, and Jesus certainly um he wasn't a doormat. When like justice for
Mhm.
Jesus wasn't just saying like, well, God's gonna get it, or like let go and let God. Like he messed things up at times. He spoke harshly. He spoke harshly to Peter, one of his best friends and disciples. He spoke harshly to religious people. But again, like he also showed grace. Like I think justice is like what he showed to the criminal on the cross and the centurion at the end. Like I think there
Yeah.
are like justice doesn't just mean payback for evil. I think like, and I think that's
Yeah.
somewhat the way we reduce it to, again, going back to my son in hockey. Like justice is not just checking the kid that checked you.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I totally agree with that, because as you were talking about Jesus's, I guess, example of justice, I thought about the woman caught in adultery who was brought out to be
Yeah.
stoned, and Jesus intervened and said, like, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And I have often been taught that story as an example of God's grace, Jesus's grace, but I think that's also justice. Like,
Yeah.
yes, so maybe she did commit adultery. Well, she did in the story, but
Yeah.
we've talked about the fact that she was the only one being punished. It takes two people to commit adultery, right? She was the only one
Yeah.
being punished. The man was nowhere to be found in the story. And also, when you take in mind the different like social standing and legal strata of women at the time, like, she didn't have a way to fight back, so Jesus was showing grace and he was showing justice, I believe, in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, and again, he's call. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what he was doing, but like as he's writing in the
Mhm.
sand, like scholars think he's like writing down the men that she slept with that were also men in the crowd, or like writing
Mhm.
down the women that these men were like cheating on their spouses with. Like, so it's like there's a lot of like gray area, but one of the things that is clear
Yeah.
is that it was provocative enough that the story says that people left, starting with the oldest and ending with the youngest, which is an interesting like presumption that you can make, that like the oldest people left because they knew there was no dog in the fight. They're like, he's got us. And the young
Yeah.
people filled with like hubris that still had like a more immature view of justice were the one that stuck around longer, until they're like, this is not winnable.
Mhm.
And then they finally, but then Jesus again, he like sends her off. He's like, I don't condemn you. That's grace. But justice is like, go and sin no more. Right? He does
Mhm.
challenge her to live a more fruitful life. And so again, I said
Yeah.
this in one of the services on Sunday. It's like there's an assumption that progressive Christians, or LGBTQ inclusive Christians specifically, don't believe in sin. And it's like, no, we just don't believe being gay is a sin. Like or at least me, like I'm sure there's plenty of progressive Christians that don't think sin is real, but like sin is real and it exists. Um, yeah, and it's as an aside, I almost brought this up earlier, but you brought this woman at the in adultery story up, and I just wanted to circle back to this. I have many pastor friends that have gone through divorces. I've gone through divorce, and all of my friends that are evangelical or more conservative, every one of them has painted their ex-wife as like a Jezebel. So like the reason that they were able to get divorced is because their wife did whatever, they cheated, or they were sowing seeds of whatever. And it is interesting because you made a quick point, not in super passing, but that like women are overlooked in this scenario. And I think the church props up the powerful. Like that's
Mhm.
not justice, really, and that's not what Jesus would have done. But the church, again, institutions try to protect themselves. They want to protect their pastors. And so like I remember when I went through my divorce, all of my like evangelical pastor friends, they were like, "Well, what did your wife do?" So that they could like try to paint me in a picture of like you were above board and like this is a biblical divorce, because if she did something, then I was able to get divorced, right? And like
Yeah.
I think we have all these little like microstructures that are built up in the church, in our theology, that tries to give permission to people in power and punish the people that are already vulnerable. And if you look at like and going back to the Old Testament, which is brutal,
Mhm.
but it's a story of liberation. Like James Cone is a great liberation theologian, and like he is a lot of his work is talking about like the Bible isn't preaching for liberation for the oppressed, and whether that's like people that are in slavery or people that are in a social caste system or women in a misogynistic society, like just whoever is being oppressed and needs liberation, like that is the lens the gospel story is through. It is not through the eyes of Rome and the people in power.
Mhm.
um and I think sometimes we read it as the people in power, or at least I do. Like I always have to remind myself that I'm reading it from a vantage point of privilege and power. And I always have to ask myself, like, how does someone read this story who's not sitting with all of the same privileges and power that I hold?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think something that I'm struck by just throughout this conversation is the levels of, I guess, how these concepts change with maturity and wisdom, I think, because I think it takes a lot of maturity and wisdom to even recognize that you, as a straight white male who is the head of a
Mhm.
church, have a decent amount of privilege reading the Bible and are reading
Yeah,
it from a position of power. And again, I said this a couple episodes ago, like I have a lot of things going for me demographically. Like I'm,
fair. Yeah,
white, straight, educated, middle class. Like I have a lot of things going for me. But yeah, it definitely gives a little, just being a woman, it gives a different lens of reading a lot of the stories, especially a lot of the stories about violence against women in the Bible, for sure. It always colors it. But I will say too, I think talking about your son and talking about even the people that talked to you when you were going through your divorce, there is this very simplistic and kind of childlike, and by childlike I do mean like childlike derogatory, like childlike immature
yeah,
view of justice, which is very like an eye for an eye. Like kids
yeah,
have this like strong sense of justice that's developmental, and I say like air quotes because it is very simplistic of like, and we, if you've spent any time around young children, you know this to be true. Like if a sibling takes a toy, that's not fair, that's mine, like he took that from
yeah,
me, he hit me, he like, it's, they are constantly like hair trigger at anything, any wrongdoing that is done against them. And
yeah,
that sense of justice has to develop and mature over time, because if we act like that as adults, society would, crumble. But there still has to be like a level of um, punishment, I suppose, and justice enacted. And I feel like, yeah, I think, I don't know. Now I feel like I'm
yeah.
losing myself in my own like
No,
thoughts about
I,
it.
I think I'm with you. Like one of the things that Annie and I talk about in parenting, and like our school, I think does a pretty good job in this. That where they go is like restorative justice and
Mm,
restorative conversations, and the idea of like, say my son hit someone at school, like the restoration of that is not us lining him up firing squad style and letting this kid punch him back, but it's
yeah,
like what do we
yeah.
do to like actually restore this to be like I take accountability for what I did. um I know what I did was wrong, and how can I know that I can't ever put the pieces back the way they were, but I can try my best to like honor where they are now and like mend it. And I think like when I think about grace, mercy, and justice, that's a little bit where I go. Is like we again pretend like if we forgive and forget, then it's like everything is as it was before it was hurt. And that's just not true. Like the scars and the pains and the scabs of like lived experience are there. Like Jesus, when he resurrected, still had nail holes, right? So it's not like uh there wasn't scars that
Mm,
were there, but depending on how you view that story, like Jesus used those wounds as a way to like help other people, right? So like doubting Thomas and other people, like he invites them to explore those. And like I think I caution myself to say what I'm going to say because it's used in like spaces I don't agree with as like another mechanism of control. But like your pain can be like a testimony or a story, right? Of
mhm.
like God's love and God's grace and God's provision. But what that doesn't mean is like Jesus never commands us to like keep getting abused. Jesus never asks us to keep getting the shit beaten out of us. Jesus never
Yeah.
says like take another one for the sake of the kingdom. Like and we all kind of have this like martyr complex and like we lift up these people and even with like the killing of Charlie Kirk, which was like tragic and brutal. And even though I disagree with him on pretty much all of his political and theological takes, like it was still awful.
Yes.
And people lift him up as a martyr, right? And being
Yeah.
like, well, this is like the greatest thing that could ever happen. And like that, I think again, is a conflation of like what justice looks like and what grace looks like and what mercy looks like. And it's just easier to put people into like sinner, saint, martyr in these easy like buckets. And the story I think Jesus is inviting us into is way messier than that. And I think, at least as I read it, it's harder to come to like really clear conclusions on things, because like that's never what I think Jesus was trying to do. Like he spoke in confusing parables and he asked a lot of questions and he didn't give a lot of answers. But now we preach it like people in my seat, they preach it like we have 100% definitive things on this. And it's like Jesus just asked us to be curious and to get better and to like draw closer to one another as we love God and love neighbor. And we've reduced it to like a set of rules and stuff. So, but again, now I'm kind of like going down a different rabbit trail, like getting on a new soapbox. But
Yeah, no, but I do think that's really beautiful. Like I talked a little bit before about like I don't know where the line is. And I'm starting to think like there is no line. Like we have to hold these two things in conversation with each other and I guess navigate them as part of a community that is working towards a common goal of, you know, bringing heaven here, paradise here. I did kind of just want to get your thoughts on, and this was in the notes that I sent you, but there's a really, I'm just going to read this because I wrote this yesterday as I was thinking it. And a really problematic evangelical claim that I am familiar with, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Danny, is that if Adolf Hitler had prayed and asked for forgiveness and salvation in the moment before he took his own life, he would be forgiven and receive entrance to the Christian afterlife, which we call heaven. This is gross. Like, I'm not even going to qualify it as like, I think this is gross. That's gross. That's a gross thing to say. And disrespectful to people impacted by the atrocities that he wrought during his time on earth and the ripple effects that those have had in the decades since. So how do we reconcile our need for justice with God's example of grace, with like the redemption of the prodigal son, the man next to Jesus on the cross, all of these examples that we've been talking about? How do we, because we touched a little bit on like the victims in all of this, like the victims in this conversation too. If we're talking about wrongdoing, there is someone that wrong was done to. Yeah. So I think this evangelical claim, talking point, whatever it is like not the gotcha that you think it is. Like it's not saying like, I don't think that this is like a good thing to be like a selling point of Christianity, but I want to know your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, I mean, what I appreciate about it is that they're trying to say that the grace of God has no bounds. So I would say I appreciate that. What I don't appreciate about it, and this would go with Hitler and Epstein and anyone that's like impacted a lot of people, obviously far different scales between those two stories, but both people that have impacted communities and like ripple effects that are like generations later, right? And that like the idea that someone that was killed in the hands of Hitler in the Holocaust, even if not directly, like that their eternal paradise would be standing next to this person forever is like pretty wild. And I remember I had one of my good friends who's a rabbi on the podcast many moons ago. You can go find the episode, and we talked about heaven and hell and the afterlife and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, I don't even know if I believe in heaven or hell, because like life has been so much like hell, like with what my people have had to go through with the Holocaust. And the idea of an afterlife, I don't think he would imagine Hitler would have a space in any sort of level of paradise, right? So I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth. First being like, I think it can't be by human standards of justice, grace, love, and righteousness, any idea that like if I hurt you in any fraction of a way of those two examples that we used, that you would feel safe, loved, and seen being in community with me every day. Like, again, like I remember when I first went through my divorce, I was like in a lot of pain and anger and frustration. And like I remember seeing my ex-wife across like a Schnucks, and like that was hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
And like that, I mean, that's like small potatoes in comparison to these things, right? So I think that's something that from my vantage point now, I have a really hard time reconciling how that could be paradise. But on the I think if God gets what God wants, then God is going to get everybody in to be in paradise, and that would have to include the most atrocious people of all time. I don't know the mechanics of how that works out, but I actually been more with your gross evangelical friends on this in terms of like I think that God will get what God wants, but I don't know the mechanics of it. But like when I look at the gospel story, there are two things that I'm going to say, and I think they're going to sound competing. One, the phrase that if it's not good news for everyone, it's not good news. I think that actually applies in this story. But I'll go back to what I said earlier. If this story is not through the lens of those that need liberation, then it's also not good news. And so, like, what I have a hard time from my vantage point now saying is I don't know how liberation could happen in a world where someone has to see their abuser in paradise, in that, because that just doesn't sound like paradise. So I get the tension of the mechanics of it because it doesn't seem like it fulfills true justice and liberation to have that happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Also, we're 4 episodes into this. I want you to know this. I am very happy. I'm an 8, so I don't need you to agree with me. So I want to hear all the reasons you think that's wrong, if you have to. Like, because I want to know, because I think that's how we get better as people. Because there's an assumption that I went to seminary, I'm a pastor, and so therefore I have all the right answers. I don't. I'm like still going through this journey, and so I actually could have a really twisted and wrong view of like what eternal justice looks like. So I'd be interested to know, like, where do you stand in this, and what can I learn from you and your perspective of
this? Well, first of all, I think you know me well enough at this point to know that I have no problem telling you that I think you're wrong.
I do know that, yeah. But I wanted to let you know that I want you to say that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I do have a different viewpoint. Ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a thought experiment. We don't know for real what's going to happen in the afterlife, if there even is an afterlife. Personally, I don't really think there is one. It's not helpful for me to believe in a heaven or hell, especially in the way that I have been taught. And this is something I go back and forth on a lot. So maybe in 6 months, I'll like listen to this episode again and be like, oh, weird, I didn't believe in heaven at the time. Like I go back and forth a lot on this, but as of right now, I don't think there's a real afterlife. So that actually makes this a lot easier.
Do you believe, clarifying question, but I think you just clarified it in what you said, because you said an afterlife. But do you not believe in a heaven and hell, heaven or hell, or just afterlife in general? I think you just clarified it.
Yeah, I don't think I believe in an afterlife. Okay. I think that there are a lot of ways that we can apply the ideas of heaven and hell to our lived experience on earth. Kind of like your rabbi friend was saying, we have experienced hell in life, some people more than others. And we have experienced moments of paradise and happiness and kind of that heaven. So I think, we can bring both heaven and hell here to our time on earth. But I don't know. Yeah, the idea of an afterlife, I can't really square it. So I personally don't think it exists. I don't think that there's anything wrong with thinking that no, there are some, if you use it as a weapon against others, that is bad. But
well, that's where I agree. And I want you to finish your thought, but that's where I would also agree is like, I do believe in an afterlife, but I think it's a less helpful. So this is where I do think your thought experiment can get gross in terms of the people that represent it, is that it's dismissing the atrocities now that we have the opportunity to rewrite. And I think it's a evacuation to a later date. And whenever I talk about heaven and hell, I try to frame it in the same way Jesus would have, which Jesus never talked about hell. He talked about a place that we often translate to hell, but not
Mhm.
hell. But he talked about like disintegration and like not being integrated. And he talked about paradise and shalom and wholeness, or like integration, of like we not use today. But he talked about what we did here and now mattering. And so like, as much as I think grace will ultimately win out and love will ultimately win out, I think it is a gross, unhelpful thought experiment, because what it ends up doing, this is where we would agree, is that it gives permission for this stuff to keep happening, because this world doesn't matter as much as the next one. And I'm like, care about here and now, and let's do better here and now. And not in like a shameful do better today than you did tomorrow way, but like, but as a human collective, let's do better, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where I end up in application of this, because I'm a big believer in second chances. I'm a big believer in a redemption story. And I think that our responsibility as Christians who are working towards this wholeness, this goodness, like paradise, the only thing we really know we have is our life here today. Like that's the only thing that we are 100% guaranteed that we can like objectively say is happening. And so why wait for some eventual theoretical heaven? Why not be spending your time on earth working towards like as close as we can get to that now, you know?
Yeah.
So I think when I think about justice and grace, and these things have to kind of exist concurrently, it is with the end goal of like shaping our current world into a place that looks more like heaven. So yeah, I don't know if that really answered the question.
No,
I think, yeah, the thought experiment for me about like Hitler going to heaven is I kind of like took the easy way out and being like, well, I don't believe in heaven. So there's
You're like, well, I don't actually believe it because I don't think there's a place for him to go.
I definitely took kind of the cheater's way out.
So can I ask you a follow-up question?
Yeah.
And I think this is going to make sense, but I'm baking it in my mind. So I might get it out and we might just cut it out of the episode because it's so bad. But
Okay.
let's take this out of the Holocaust and Hitler and let's move it back to ice hockey. And there's a penalty box. So the penalty box is not a theory. It does exist. And heaven is ice time, right?
Okay.
So how do you... No, I lost it. It's not going to work. It doesn't work. I can't do it. So I was gonna say, how do you just allow the person to like not get beat up all the time, and how do you allow the person who does the beating up to not just be kicked out of the league? You know what I mean? Like at what point, like what is the line of demarcation? But I don't know that that's a helpful thought experiment either. So
yeah, I don't know, because my answer to that would be sometimes the person gets kicked out of the league. But that's a very
that was my
like
thought too as I started.
Yeah, that's
like
a very like functional.
Yeah.
Because yeah, that definitely like when we're talking about ice hockey, that's like how it would apply. Is like sometimes it's like you're constantly causing problems and hurting people and disrupting the game, so you actually can't play anymore. But
as
then
I
we
was
like as a metaphor.
As I was saying it, like the kids that I know that have been kicked out of my son's league, like I was like, well, I guess that kid literally got banished. So so it didn't work out as well as that. But I think so. That's what I think is interesting about all of this is like, and to bring it all full circle, I think we just have and you said this actually, but like we have a immature, childish view of justice, and I think that served us well in some ways. And I think Jesus tells us have faith like a child. So maybe we're supposed to have a view of justice like a child. I don't know, but I think there are certain times we want that because it feels righteous, and other times it feels wrong. And I think what's interesting to me is the feeling of right versus wrong seems at best subjective and at worst arbitrary to me, of like when grace gets to override that. That's my kind of view on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like my kind of I don't feel like I have any more clarity on the demarcation between grace and justice, or what roles they need to play or anything. And that's okay. I didn't think in this 45-minute conversation we would like really nail down when to show grace and when to enact justice.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is a really slippery, and by slippery, I'm just mean like it's hard to like grasp. Like it's really kind of this,
Yeah.
I'm thinking of like misty, like I can't like grab it. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I talked
It's
about
tough.
this in my sermon on Sunday. Like, again, another major difference, at least for me and my conservative contemporaries, and I think many people that call the well their home, is that the urgency is different, right? So when you look at that example of the afterlife, like you just don't have the same urgency. But I also don't have the same urgency because I don't look at hell and heaven as like a carrot dangling. But I think like that's what creates some of these, I think, tensions in the thought experiment. And then the way that it's applied in the graph that you pointed, right? Because there is an urgency if stealing candy is as bad as the Holocaust. There's an urgency if everyone is ultimately already there because they're bad and we're trying to work backwards from that. Like there's urgency that is applied. And I think that I look at grace and God's version of justice and God's version of mercy as something that like removes the urgency that we often place because of religion. Maybe is my final ending thought on this.
Yeah. And part of me wonders if we have just like and by we, I mean like humans, if we've just like structured the hell out of this. Like we need structure.
Yeah.
Structure is important. And there should be justice systems in the world. But I feel like the example that Jesus gave us kind of uses the tools that we already have. Like we already have an understanding of what's right and wrong. We have feelings. We have the ability to reconcile. We have all of these things. And I feel like Jesus kind of showed us how to use those to enact grace and justice. And oftentimes where we get it wrong is when we kind of overthink it or overwork it, perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if that's correct in every scenario at every scale. Certainly not. But that's just kind of, when you were talking, that is where my mind went.
Yeah. This has been an interesting one. I love these kind of conversations in the sense that I just like debate and arguing. And I was thinking about like, I don't know if this is true or a fully formed thought, but I'm like, I wonder sometimes if this is critiquing my own belief system here, but like if I would say that the most deplorable person has a space in heaven because my initial introduction to religion was that I am a terrible person on par with these people. And so part of my understanding of grace is like, if God can't redeem them, God can't redeem me. And so like, I wonder if I'm still untangling some of those things, like in my own thoughts. Or if that's really the way God, I don't know. Like I could argue either way that like God's grace is so abundant. It's truly for everyone. And it's from a framework of like goodness, or I just think so little of myself that I have to need that grace because I think, and I've been told I'm on par with all these people. I don't know. That just popped in my mind as we were talking.
No, yeah, that's real. That's something that and maybe my opinion of grace is because I, in reaction to that feeling, have swung really far in the other direction of being like, no, I am a good person. Like I try really hard. I follow Jesus. I am kind and I don't get it right all the time, but I'm not a serial killer. Dang it. Like you know, I've swung too far, which I have had to be conscious the whole time of, thinking too highly of myself and like saying like, yeah, you're not a serial killer. Great job. But like, you can use your words to hurt people. You can like be selfish, and and by you, I'm saying me, like I'm saying these things to myself. Like I can be selfish. I can be greedy. I can say words in anger that hurt other people. And like, that is still harm. I'm still causing harm. So yeah.
We're going to have to put a E on this episode for all of like the things we use that YouTube and Spotify is going to flag.
Oh,
like
really? What did
Hitler and Epstein and killer
Oh,
and serial killer. Like, I'm sure that this will not be our most viral episode because of all the flagged statements that we've used. But I'll just put a little E on it. It's going to be great.
Is that explicit?
Yeah.
Saying serial killer?
Well, I have no idea, but we're going to find out as we see the response to this episode. But I appreciated the conversation. I thought this was a good one. Here would be my closing thought. Like, and I'd be interested if you have anything to like end with. But my closing thought would be like, I actually think the best thing we can do in this is have these conversations, because I watch people on the far right reduce things to the one side and people on the far left reduce things. And certainly you and I are not caricatures of either side of those. Like, I think we're probably far closer to each other. So it's not like we're arguing from the left and the right. But I do think the more conversations we have thoughtfully, and I appreciated like you raised something that I think you raised a thought experiment we would disagree on. And we have not like walked out of this hating each other. And I wish more people would have conversations like that, whether it's real life things or thought experiments. Like, we just don't talk about things we disagree with because we're kind of a conflict averse world right now, because you're either right or wrong or good or bad.
Yes. Yeah. I'm trying to get a lot more comfortable with disagreeing with people and with sitting with the discomfort of that. And there's levels to it, like if I believe that, if I believe that a minoritized group, insert here, are equal to the ethnic and racial majority of the country, and you don't, then that's not a difference in opinion. Like, one of those is bigotry. Yeah. But like, I read an article the other day where I was like, dang, like this is making me mad, but it's not because it's bad and wrong and evil. It's because I don't agree with it. Like what you are saying is correct, but I don't like the way you're saying it. I don't like the way it's being presented, and it's challenging some of my own biases and some of my own things. So that was a good experience for me to, step outside of my kind of echo chamber a little bit and remember that it's okay to disagree. It's okay to not like the way that somebody said something. Like, you're allowed to have a difference of opinion. And having conversations like this where like we're still friends, I'm not mad at you. And I knew we were probably going to disagree on that anyway.
I appreciate you saying it. It felt like you walked me into it, but I appreciated it.
Sorry.
Well, I think that's good, and I appreciate that. I think like my final thought from you, and I really actually appreciated that, is like, bigotry is still bigotry, and racism is still racism, and murder is still murder, and all of these things are still those things, and so they have to be called out, and there has to be some level of justice for them. And I think our challenge is people that identify with the way of Jesus is saying, like, what is my response to that, by naming it, creating accountability for it, and then moving forward in light of Jesus. Like, what do we do with that?
Yeah. I don't know.
Maybe next week we'll find out.
Maybe we'll find out next week. Maybe it'll take one more 45-minute conversation, and then we've got it nailed down.
Yeah. Well, we're bending closer to 60 minutes. And so if we can't get it in 55 minutes, we'll never get it.
Yeah, that's true. We should just give up.
We should give up. So, all right. Well, let's do this again next week.
All right. Sounds good.